Okay, I'll call to order this regular meeting of council for Tuesday, May the 8th, and we'll have the national anthem. Okay, is there any disclosure of interests, pecuniary nature, general nature thereof? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to read the motion.
That council now move into closed session under section 239 3.1 of the Municipal Act 2001 for education and training. One item, Integrity Commissioner Services and Code of Conduct.
Have a mover on that, please? Councillor Gilmore, seconder. Councillor McClellan, all in favor? And that is carried, and we'll move into closed session. Thank you. So I'll look to our planner, Sarah, now to speak to this application.
So the property is located at 53154 Wilford Road, and it is 7.2 hectares in size. It's currently being used for residential and agricultural purposes. The property was the subject of a surplus farm dwelling application, which was considered by the Committee of Adjustment on April 17th, and that was conditionally approved by the committee. One of those conditions was that Part 2, being the agricultural lands that are being retained by the farmer, be rezoned to prohibit dwellings in perpetuity. And this is in accordance with provincial, regional, and township planning policy for surplus farm dwelling applications. So the property is currently zoned agricultural A2, and it does have a small environmental protection area on the northeast corner of the lot. And the purpose of this application is to rezone Part 2 from agricultural A2 to agricultural A2-1 for agricultural purposes only, and agricultural A2-66 to recognize a reduced lot area of 6.2 hectares and a reduced lot frontage of 83.41 meters. In terms of, so notice of the public meeting was given on March 26th to property owners within 120 meters of the subject property, and as well as to various external agencies and township departments with a request for comment on the application. Some of the comments that we received from Niagara Region Planning and Development Services, they noted no objection to the zoning amendment. The Conservation Authority also noted no objection. And they did indicate that should there be any development or site alteration on Part 2 in the future, that will require a MPCA review and approval. Bell Canada had no concerns or objections, and the Township Building and Septic Departments noted no issues, and CP Rail, again, noted no concerns. Any comments that are received at the public meeting or after the public meeting will be addressed in my staff report.
Okay, thank you. Are there questions from council, please? Discussion? Okay, seeing none. I look for questions or comments, input from anyone in the gallery. Anyone in the gallery wish to make any comments, input on this issue? Okay, seeing none. Next steps, please, planner.
So I will be preparing a recommendation report regarding the application for council's consideration that will come at a later date. If anyone wishes to be notified of the passing of the proposed zoning bylaw or the refusal of the request to amend the zoning bylaw, you must make a written request to the clerk for the township. If a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submission to the Township of Wainfleet before the bylaw is passed, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision to the local planning appeal tribunal. If a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submission to the township before the bylaw is passed, the person or public body may not be added as a party to the hearing of an appeal before the local planning appeal tribunal unless, in the opinion of the tribunal, there are reasonable grounds to do so.
Okay, thank you. That's it. We'll close that issue. That's completed. Move on to the mayor's remarks. I'd like to thank Councillors Gilmore and Van Vliet for fulfilling the role of Deputy Mayor during my recent absence. I understand everything went very well, and it's a good experience. I last night attended the Niagara Regional Police Service Annual Awards Ceremony, where service members and members of the public were recognized for their invaluable contributions to the community. Tomorrow evening, Councillor Gilmore and I will be attending a keynote address with Minister of Finance Vic Fedeli in Niagara Falls. The NPCA board will meet next Wednesday on May the 15th. A brief update on the NPCA. They have developed, or in the process of developing, a skills matrix for the members of the board to establish the permanent board once that is ready to be done. That matrix is still being developed, and once it is finished, then we should be in a position to apply our applicants to that matrix and make a selection for the right person. So that's where that sits right now. It's still in flux. The temporary board, myself being on that board, is until June 6th, and it's quite possible it could get extended even past that. So they've turned the corner in many areas and resolved a number of legal issues, and from my perspective, the NPCA board is moving ahead, and the work is finally getting back to the focus on the work, so it's good. Our farmers market at Meridian Credit Union will launch next Thursday, May 16th from 3 to 7 p.m. I encourage everyone to come out to that. We're trying to grow that, and it could be a really tremendous farmers market here as time moves on. Port Colborne Wainfleet Chamber of Commerce is hosting the Mayor's Update Breakfast at Jericho House, May 28th. I will be participating in that. And our next regular meeting of council will be later that evening, Tuesday, May the 28th. And of interest, the next Niagara Police Service Board meeting is being held May 30th right here in these chambers. And all are welcome. If citizens of Wainfleet want to see how the Police Service Board works, it's an excellent opportunity to come out and see it right here in our home building. So questions from the public are permitted at this meeting. So it's an excellent opportunity to come out and see what's going on with the police. Councillor McClellan?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. What time was that meeting on the 30th? Police Services Board?
Yeah, it's at, I believe it starts at 8:30 a.m. Yeah. Okay, and we'll move on to the adoption of our minutes from minutes of the regular meeting held of council on April the 9th, 2019. Is there any discussion, corrections? Seeing none. Have a mover for that, please. Councillor Gilmore, seconder. Councillor McClellan, all in favor for the adoption of those minutes, and that is carried. Okay, moving on to admin staff report, fitness for duty. And Staff Lee Gudgeon, would you like to speak to that at all?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to all of council.
Excuse me, we'll just have a brief recess for a few minutes. Apparently our cameras are not streaming properly, so we'll just, we'll hold that report. We'll just stop for a second. Okay. Okay, for those out there who were watching the streaming, we had a technical issue with the cameras. We think we have everything back working again. And so we are right now working on fitness for duty in the workplace policy, and we're asking our manager of human resources to speak to that, please, his report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through your worship, to all of council. The fitness for duty policy is an operational policy which we're enacting in order to protect, increase safety and protect the well-being of residents of the township, staff, employees. And it centers around a requirement of employees to report to work in a manner that is fit for duty. And in an effort to reduce impairment and the possibility of impairment. This policy would apply, of course, to anyone who does work in the township. And we've tried to strike a balance here out of respect for our employees. Again, we're not looking for issues, but rather increasing our ability to be able to respond to issues should they occur. And of course, we're trying to strike a balance where we recognize that, you know, we account for issues related to impairing substances, and we recognize those in accordance with the law. But we're taking these steps primarily under the Occupational Health and Safety Act.
Thank you. Are there any questions or discussion by any of the councillors? Okay, seeing none. Recommendation is that this report be received as information and that the fitness for duty in the workplace policy be appended to this report, be adopted as circulated. Have a mover for that, please. Councillor Van Vliet, seconder. Councillor Cridland. All in favor? And that is carried. The next staff report we have is from our drainage superintendent. And would you like to speak to that, please?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to all of council. This is the first apportionment agreement that will be coming to this term of council, so I thought it'd be best to come speak to it. So it's the practice of the township to provide an apportionment agreement for any property severances on the lands assessed to a municipal drain. In order to maintain fair and equitable billing on all of our drain maintenance activities, we need to maintain up-to-date property ownership records. So changes in ownership and lot sizes affect the benefit derived from drainage works in the amount of obligation and maintenance charges. So for the past 3 years, in 2018, we completed 3 apportionment agreements. 2017, we did 4. 2016, we did 3. So basically, whenever a property is severed that falls within the watershed of a municipal drain, we complete an apportionment agreement. So then the property owners agree to the changes, and it allows us to move forward with fair and equitable billing for any future maintenance on the drains.
Okay, thank you. Any questions on that report? Seeing none, recommendation that this report be received and that the agreement on share of assessment attached hereto as Appendix A be approved. Mover on that, please. Councillor Gilmore, seconder. Councillor McClellan. All in favor, please. And that is carried. Okay, we're moving on to our fire staff report, and I'll look to Chief Alcock to speak to that, please. Is there anything that you want to speak to?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, this report is just an overview of the fire department operations and emergency responses, training, and operations that the fire department has conducted through the first quarter of 2019.
Okay, thank you. Questions or discussion? Councillor Cridland.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's always great to see what's also in your future plan. Just 2 things we start to mention, and we're going to see the fire station property and fire station project. Could you just let us know what phase we're in now as that comes forward? And then the second part was as we proceed along that project for transparency, what would be suggestions for when the public starts to see some information on that project? Thank you.
So at present, the operations manager and myself are putting together, now that the budget's been approved, a list of the projects that we want to achieve in 2019. So that way we can be project ready for 2020.
Okay. Any other questions? Councillor Gilmore?
Thank you, Mayor. Chief, in the last term, remember we used to hear a lot about unknown 911s. Are those, they're not listed, maybe you don't list them, maybe the problem's fixed itself.
So the previous council had taken the unknown 911s out of the core service, so that was something that we did not respond to. Dispatch has been notified, and we don't get called to those anymore. If they do, it's a very few. It's a breakdown of the dispatch system.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions on that? Okay, seeing none, recommendation, this report be received for information. Mover on that, please. Councillor Van Vliet, seconder. Councillor Gilmore, all in favor, and that report is carried. Okay, the next item is the memo from our planner, bylaw 30-2019. Would you like to speak to that at all?
Through your worship to all of council. So this came about when the property owner of 21849 Highway 3 purchased the property. And during the transaction, his lawyer identified a strip of land that runs along the frontage of his property, which is owned by the township, and splits his property from the Highway 3 right-of-way. And through some research, it was determined that this was an error made when the Ministry of Transportation did take over Highway 3. The property owner made application to dispose, requesting that the township dispose of this. The strip is about 0.61 meters in width and then runs the full frontage of the property, which is about 240 meters. Direction from the previous council was to go through the disposure procedure, and so today the bylaw is on the agenda to allow that to occur.
Thank you. And so we'll have a motion. We'll receive this, please. Any questions on that, first of all? No? Okay. Motion to receive it. Councillor McClellan, seconder. Councillor Gilmore, all in favor? And that memo is received. Look to Public Works report from our operations manager, Mr. Nan, on the cemetery mower purchase. Richard, would you like to speak to that, please?
Through your worship to all members of council, this was a linked project that was submitted for capital purchasing and the capital budget deliberations this year. The mower and the trailer were submitted as a combined unit when we did the budget deliberations. But we actually separated the actual purchasing and the actual quotations for the different items. This one here is the item for the mower itself, and the following report will be for the trailer. We did a lot of investigating, trying to find various agencies and various manufacturers for a certain specification that we were looking for a mower. And unfortunately, we only found one manufacturer that actually built the mower, the type of mower that we were looking for, with a diesel engine with an industrial sized deck on it rather than just a stamped residential style mower. And at that point, we decided to come back to council in separating the two items. So this one will be for the cemetery mower for the purchase through our local supplier, and the costs associated are attached to the report.
Thank you. Any questions on this? Okay, seeing none. Recommendation that report be received and that council authorize the manager of operations to purchase a zero-turn mower in the amount of $16,110.51 from Benberg Farm and Industrial Equipment Limited. A mover on that, please. Councillor Van Vliet, seconded. Councillor Gilmore, all in favor, and that is carried. Okay, and in conjunction with that is the trailer. Richard, anything you want to speak to on that?
Through your worship, if you, this is the part of the LINK project, and I know there was questions during the capital budget about the various items and the budget that we submitted forward. The recommendation in this report, just wanted to note to you, is it necessarily is not the cheapest bid, but the bid that we're submitting also includes galvanizing of the trailer. So it's an additional $1,100 worth of product that we're getting to try and stabilize this for a longer term use and lifetime use.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, seeing none, recommendation report be received, and that council authorize the manager of operations to purchase trailer in the amount of $9,209.67 from Hitchman Trailers and Supply Limited. A mover on that, please. Councillor McClellan, seconder. Councillor Gilmore, all in favor, and that is carried. And the next item is a memo from the Operations Department. Richard, would you like to speak to that, please?
Through your worship, to yourself and all members of council, this is just to conclude the discussions that took place during capital budget deliberations in regards to the skate park project.
Okay, any questions? Okay, seeing none, I have a mover to receive this, please. Councillor Gilmore, seconder. Councillor McClellan, all in favor, and that memo is received. Okay, we're moving on to bylaw enforcement staff report. And I look to our bylaw officer to speak to the first one regarding Maplewood Drive and Woodland Drive issues, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, to you and the rest of the council. Excuse me. This report is a result of parking issues back in the summer of 2018. Public meeting and online survey were conducted to request feedback from residents in the Maplewood Drive and Woodland Drive in regards to parking restrictions on these roads. You will find in this report the results from that public meeting and online survey, 2017 and 2018 parking ticket statistic report. Staff has also reached out to our operations manager, fire chief, and Niagara EMS to comment on road conditions related to the parking issues.
Thank you. Are there any questions from our councillors on this? Councillor Cridlin.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, one question I have is for Mr. Nan, just with regards to the roads. I noticed one of the options is to consider parking on one side of the road. So my question is, can you provide just a brief update on any plans from our current road study that would allow for improvement to these roads that would permit safe one-sided parking? Thank you.
Through your worship, to Councillor Cridlin. At the discussions we had during council deliberations for capital, it was initially placed on the list. Maplewood and Woodland were originally submitted as part of a capital wish list, let's say, but they didn't obviously make the restraints that we had this year. But Maplewood and Woodland are both on the top priority, or in the top priority as far as 1 to 5 on our priority list for reconstruction. The difference would be if council chooses an option for parking, whether the cost would substantially increase or not. For instance, the budget line item we would present would basically to repair the road as is, but making it to the 6-meter width, with allowing for the grass shoulders and the ditching, etc. If council chooses to provide like on-street parking, for instance, we would actually have to widen the road surface, which would include moving ditches, doing storm sewer work, etc., etc. So the cost would dramatically go up if that was the case, but I submit that to council for your discretion.
Okay, any other questions? Councillor McClellan, did you have one before? Okay. Councillor Gilmore?
Thank you, Mayor. I guess when I read through the survey and the results of the meeting, there doesn't seem to be any general consensus. Like, I hear everything from, we didn't have a problem, you created a problem, to all kinds of other things which lead us really nowhere. So I'm just wondering how we give relief to the residents that live there. Can you refresh my memory as to why we wouldn't just allow them to park on the grass in front of their own house? Like that, let's start with that one.
Excuse me, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Gilmore. In the previous parking bylaw, 89-2000, parking on boulevards and shoulders were, if it was signed, was not a permitted use. 2016, at the end of the summer season, that term of council decided to make both Maplewood Drive and Woodland Drive no parking on both sides at all times, which would mean the shoulders and boulevards would now be no parking areas. That has carried through to the new parking bylaw, and to date has not changed. Those restrictions were in place in 2016, and they are enforced that way today. I hope that answers your question.
Not really. Are people allowed to park on their own lawn without getting a ticket in front of their house off the graveled portion of their driveway? I'm not talking about the shoulder. I'm talking about on their side of the ditch.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, so you're talking about on their front lawn, not on the road allowance portion?
Correct.
I believe that might be a zoning issue. I don't know if Sarah can address this.
Through your worship to Councillor Gilmore. So we don't have any specific requirements other than the number of parking spots you need to provide. So that's a minimum of 2 for each single detached dwelling. Anything above that, we don't have any regulations to say that you can't park on your lawn, because we don't even have regulations to say that a driveway has to be asphalt versus gravel. It's just that we have to provide a minimum of 2 parking spots on the lot and not within a road allowance.
I'll just look to the CAO to comment on this, please.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, just to build on that a little bit, and while it sounds like we may not have those specific regulations or restrictions, one of the things that property standards bylaws, clean yards bylaws, zoning bylaws often have contained within them are regulations regarding keeping free and clear space around structures, around in your front yard, etc. In the event that there is an emergency response that might be required to a property, if a fire department, for example, has to stage pumpers, tankers, holding ponds for their water in order to battle a fire, for example. When you start obstructing your front yard or your rear yard or whatever in and around a required building, that can lead to impacts or implications in our ability to respond in an emergency situation. Likewise, an ambulance responding in the middle of the night to a property, if the entire yard is full of vehicles or debris or buildings or whatever, it can impact those types of responses.
Yeah, you try.
Councillor McClellan.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the bylaw officer, Mark. I know in other municipalities I've seen where they put down the concrete blocks where the grass grows to. You've seen they use them for fire emergency driveways between buildings and that. Is that something that I know, so we just explained that you don't want the whole front yard done, but can we say you can do that so you keep the grass so it looks right on our grass area? And then limit the number of cars that you can do that. So you have 2 cars in your driveway, maybe you can do this for a third car and it gets it off the road. I mean, I understand these places were built, there was 1 car, 2 cars maximum. The world isn't like that anymore. People living there, they have 2 adult children living at home with them still, and there's 4 cars at the residence. You know, how do we work to kind of help them out with this, but not put them on the street? I don't want a liability. So,
Through Mr. Mayor, one of the major issues, like you said, these houses were built a long time ago. We have to be concerned with septic systems. You cannot park a vehicle over a septic system for obvious reasons. So we'd have to take that into consideration. But that is definitely an option that we can look at.
thank you.
Okay, Councillor Gilmore.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess the issue, like, with widening those roads, I think that the residents are going to have a problem if we build those roads to standard, because that's, if we move that back and allow for parking, the ditch is going to be 2 feet from their front porch. So I don't see how that's an option. But we have to get somewhere from where we are to some way to leave the residents alone. And like, I think we can, I don't know why we can't issue a permit at no charge to the residents so their vehicles are identified and ticket everybody else that violate. I'm not, people, generally, they're going to have room for their own cars in their driveway, and if they get a visitor, well, it's going to be temporary. And maybe they can make arrangements with their neighbors to park in their driveway. But if there's a situation where that's not possible, I still think we have to get somewhere where we leave the residents alone. And so I'm not sure that I'm comfortable proceeding on this tonight. I prefer that we defer it to the next meeting and have a little more time to think about it. But I'm going to hold off making that motion because I don't want to cut off the discussion.
Okay, so we've been looking at this already for over a month now, and we've been having discussions, and I've asked staff to be certain that we don't have a repeat of last summer, because I heard about that a lot. I'm sure other councillors heard that, where people were being bothered in their own front yards. So one of the things that we're looking at, that I've had discussions with Will and Mark about, is on the next page, options 1C, undertake property surveys to examine current private encroachments into the road allowance to assess feasibility of permitting the encroachments to continue via appropriate agreements. And by doing that, if we look at that as an option, and it's one of the options presented there, it's basically creating a parking plan for each resident who would like a parking plan created for their home. So if they come to us and say, I want to park 3 cars or 4 cars, when my kids come on a Sunday afternoon, I need room for 4 cars. So we would work through that with them, and for that property, create a specific parking plan that is probably, will be outside of our bylaws, but they'll be okay because they've had an encroachment agreement drafted with the township and agreed to. That's one of the options, because I like Councillor Gilmore. I think the same. This area was built in the 1910s and 20s, and we're trying to apply modern standards to something that it just doesn't work. And so I think that about the only way around that is to create an individualized parking plan for each homeowner who wishes to have one done. That's one option for sure that we want to look at. So. And we're going to definitely go much easier on the enforcement in respect to homeowners living on those streets, and try to accommodate and work together with them, as opposed to what I heard last summer when I was campaigning down there, the constant Their words were harassment by township staff, part bylaw in regards to the parking of the vehicles. So we don't want a repeat of that again. So that's important. So Councillor Gilmore, you wanted to make a motion to defer this, or do we want to accept this and then just work on the option 1C there, where perhaps we start to examine private encroachment policies? I'll look to Councillor McClellan for comment, please.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, option C sounds very nice, but I see it being very expensive. Who's going to pay for the surveys? You're going to use Niagara Navigator and say it's close enough? If you got to pay for a survey, who picks that up? And my other comment is, and I don't know if there is an area close by that there's a vacant lot, could we suggest that the neighbors buy the vacant lot and make it a parking lot? And will planning allow that so that that can happen and we get this issue out of the way? So if there's a place close by, you can walk 3 minutes or 5 minutes. I've seen it in other places and it works. So, we're not reinventing a wheel. It's just changing the thought to here. So can we say, yes, there's a lot that's a 2-minute walk away from here, and maybe all the neighbors chip in and they buy it and it's a common lot and they each house owns a share of it, but we get parking off the street so our fire trucks and ambulances can get through.
Okay, thank you. The first part, their costs would be borne by the homeowners. A township taxpayer is not going to pay that. That's specifically for that lot, is what we're looking at there in regards to encroachment. The parking lot issue is good, but it doesn't answer everything. One gentleman last year said to me, I have 2 cars. I'm not able to walk very well. I can't have any friends come to visit me because they have to park 300 yards down the road and they're on walkers as well. So in some situations where we have mobility issues, we still have to figure out some way that people can park, have an extra car or 2 and come and park in their yards. So it's still not a straight answer on this. I don't know if there's a solution. It's just what's the best that we can come up with, because it's designed from way back and we're trying to work modern rules into it, and it's just not working for us. So I don't know what the answer is. Councillor Cridlin?
I'm not opposed to both of the ideas, deferral or decision, but we have to acknowledge that we gained a lot of safety out of what we were trying to do at the beginning. And maybe what we're experiencing is an implementation problem. So it's not uncommon that, traffic's going to continue to increase in the Lakeshore area, parking demand is going to continue. So if we're looking at solutions, we're always going to have to keep our fire lane areas safe, number one. Yes, there's a bit of fallout in what is a loss. That's a real loss if you've lost your parking spot. There was a suggestion from one resident about one section in our bylaw that talks about boulevards and the shoulders that maybe isn't really a fit in this area that we're talking about. So it's another option that I would throw out, that if the enforcement was only on the traveled portion of the road, that might also be a way forward, and that we consider implementation. So we have a chart that shows there was 9 tickets. I think we could probably reach out to the people that are impacted the most, let them know, the other thing I read in the comments is they weren't certain of how to park or where to park. So yesterday, they knew exactly where they could park. They never had to think about it. Change happened. And however we might have implemented it for safety purposes, I think now we're feeling the pain of that implementation. And if we can get ahead of where do I park my car this summer, where do my friends park my car, I think we could probably alleviate without reducing anything.
Yeah, and that's where the site-specific for that property parking plan would work for us, if that was to come to be. So I'll look to the CAO for comments.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, just one comment regarding the idea of amending the bylaw to permit broader boulevard parking. One of the things that the Ontario Municipal Act has in place is something called minimum maintenance standards with respect to roadways. And we are required to maintain roadways in other areas where vehicles are expected to travel within our road allowance to certain standards. And boulevards are within the limits of the roadway, and if we invite or permit persons to park their vehicles on the boulevard, from a liability perspective, the municipality is assuming or authorizing people to use that for the parking of vehicles. We then have an obligation to ensure that those surfaces are appropriate for the use under whatever the prevailing conditions might be. So, for example, if you were to park a vehicle out there today in a nice muddy, sort of damp, wet condition, the boulevard will become rutted. A person getting in or out of the car, and again, if we go back to that photo that we just had up, you see some roadside ditches on the side, which may or may not be waterlogged or full of water. A person getting out of a vehicle into a ditch like that, who were to slip or fall or injure themselves, could potentially, we could see ourselves being sued or found liable for not maintaining that portion of roadway for its intended use, which in the case of this would be potentially an intended use of parking. So I'm not saying you can't do it, but I am saying that there are legal ramifications associated with directing people to a certain area for parking or otherwise, and we would have an obligation to ensure that that area is appropriately maintained. And I believe that's why the proposal that's contained in the staff report talks about potentially improving those areas or a portion of them at some point in time in the future as an option. Now, the encroachment agreements that were identified by the mayor in option 1C, I believe, if we were to enter into an encroachment agreement for somebody to basically encroach on our boulevard, that then shifts the onus of maintenance and liability from us to them, and the township is less exposed from a pure liability perspective. So I just raised that as an option. I'm not saying you can't do it, but I'm saying that there are potential implications, and I know that if we were to seek a legal opinion, for example, our lawyers would be able to advise us on what you should and shouldn't do with respect to that kind of action.
Just one question from myself to the CAO. On an encroachment issue, if somebody moves forward and makes that agreement with us, would that be, if they sold their property, would that go with them, or would the new people have to make a whole new encroachment agreement?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that would be a decision of council at the time that the agreement is entered into. So you could include a clause in there that says that the heirs and successors of the current person you're in agreement with also gets the benefit of that agreement, so it could carry forward. Or if council decides that it would prefer not to, it's totally at the whim of the council.
Okay, any other discussion on this? Councillor Van Vliet?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So if we did an encroachment with these people, how is a bylaw officer to tell if that's the owner's car or just somebody visiting the beach or the quarry?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, if an encroachment agreement were entered into, that property owner is, for all intents and purposes, renting that land from the township, and they treat it as their own land. So the bylaw officer would know that there's an encroachment agreement at the red brick house, and the bylaw officer would not conduct any enforcement because that boulevard is no longer boulevard. That boulevard is, for all intents and purposes, the property of the house owner. So they can use that for parking, and they are responsible for their own enforcement of parking. If they want to permit their friends on there, that's up to them. If there's somebody there that they don't know whose car that is, that becomes the onus of the property owner to get that car out of there whether it's through a notice on the windshield, or whether it's through the property owner calling a tow truck and saying, there's a car parked on my property, without my permission, I want it gone. So it becomes purely the realm of the property owner on how they want to deal with it, unless there are other provisions provided for in the agreement. But otherwise, it would be turned over completely to the property owner to deal with as they want.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? As I look at this, and I've been looking at this already for quite a while, like I say, I don't see solutions to it because it's not an easy solution. And I think that developing the procurement and encroachment specifically for each house is probably our ultimate answer, I'm guessing. Cost borne by the homeowner. I would suggest that that is something that becomes part of that property and can be sold as a chattel with the property and goes with it. I don't know. I don't know any other answer. We've looked at this quite a bit and tried to figure it out, and that option to me makes the most sense. But it would take time. It would take time, and during that time, we would obviously be very careful about how we do our enforcement in the area. So, Councillor McClellan, did you have a question or comment?
Yes, you said that it could be transferred or sold as. You said that it could be transferred or sold as a chattel. I think there should be an agreement with every successive owner of because it is our land. And somewhere along the line, somebody will say, no, I bought this and it's yours. And we go to widen the road 20 years from now, and then we're in a battle where you're in court fighting over it.
Yeah, good point, good point. So the mechanics of that, if we go down that road, right now it's just an option we're discussing, but when we go down that road, those are decisions we'll make as time progresses. So let's come back to, Councillor Cridlin, sorry.
No, that's fine. Through you, Mayor. So I think we're at where, if we did pick option C, it's really just that's the direction for staff. They're going to have to come back with what that little toolkit looks like. We have no idea. But then we're basically then with the recommendation of continuing pretty much the same level of enforcement, the way the residents understood it last year. And then I would focus heavily on what is our preemptive education piece that's going to go out to residents in those areas so they are certain where they know where they're going to park. And then, then we can add that to the option C. So it's sort of like a combined motion that we're looking at then, I think, right?
Yeah, it's going to take time. If we go with option C, it will take time. In the interim, we have to have a gentle approach to our parking to the residents down there, because last year there was a lot of noise and we ended up having an actual parking meeting. So I think that to move forward on that for enforcement would be basically a complaint-oriented type enforcement. I don't see any other way that we could satisfy the residents. And if we go with option C there and we're moving forward on that, that's going to take time. We don't want to be out there ticketing the heck out of everybody while we're trying to make agreements with them. So I really think that it would have to be just a very severe incident of parking or by complaint only, and we would work at it that way. And because meanwhile we're trying to work with everybody to develop the encroachment plan for their property. So. Any other discussion on this? It's a good one. Okay, do we want to have a motion to defer it, or do we want to, recommendation from staff is that the report be received and restrictions and enforcement on Maplewood Drive and Woodland Drive remain status quo, bearing in mind that we would switch our enforcement to a complaint-driven model and a much more gentle model on that, and then we have to discuss further next meeting whether we're going to go with the option of 1C. Richard? Go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we can certainly take direction, if I could recommend in the form of a motion, if you want to switch to a complaint-based parking ticket issuance model for these areas. One caution that I would make, and again, I go back to the photo that I keep pointing to, if there are vehicles that are parked in such a way as to obstruct the passage of emergency vehicles or on the traveled portion of road on a complaint-based system, we would still be ticketing those automatically. We need to keep those roadways clear, and if you are moving to a complaint-based system, the complaints would have to respond to boulevard parking or otherwise. So I bring that to your...
Councillor McClellan?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, I hate to dwell on this, but I see that exact problem happening. People are going to park there. If nobody complains and there's a fire, there's cars in the way and the fire trucks can't get down, we're liable. The insurance company's going to pay to whoever's house burns down, but then they're going to come after us because we didn't enforce this. It's got to be, we have to get the cars off the road. It's a safety issue. I know nobody likes it, and so we've got to come up with a solution that works, and it's got to be relatively quick. And in the meantime, we got to enforce what's there. And I know nobody likes it, and I wouldn't like it on my street, but it's a safety issue and a liability issue, and I don't know how else to handle it. And, you know, we can ask the fire chief, but we're gonna be liable if we don't.
Okay, thank you. Good points and good comments. Councillor Gilmore?
Thank you, Mayor. Just one more question then. If we would allow parking only on one side of the street, then in theory, there should be at no point a time where the street would be blocked and a fire truck couldn't get down. Is that a fair statement?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, unfortunately not. As you can, the picture's kind of hard to see, but I believe you have a copy of the picture on your, a little bit clearer there. Even if you were to park over as far as you could, most of, at least half of your vehicle would still be on the traveled portion of the road. And as you can see by the picture, the engine there is pretty much over quite a ways. That's the side that the firemen are going to be hooking their hoses up, pulling hoses off the truck. If there's cars parked only on one side and it's a hot day and it's permitted, that road is going to be car after car after car. So there still is an issue with that. It's just an observation I just would like to point out.
Okay, I look to the fire chief for any comments.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, remember that we're not serviced by hydrants, and so we rely on tankers to shuttle water. And part of that efficient relay is ensuring two-way traffic. And that was part of my comments, is ensuring that, in fact, we did have residual travel was 6 meters wide. Unfortunately, even looking at this particular road, you're not going to get that if you permit roadside parking.
And I'll just continue, and both those roads are dead ends, correct?
That's correct.
Well, we're between several rocks and a hard place. So I mean, my only reason to defer it would just be to think about it for 2 more weeks. However, it's not going to help. So I think we should undertake C and start the process of fixing the problem. And I sort of agree with the CAO that if you have a policy of not enforcing the bylaw and there's a problem, then you might as well not have the bylaw. So I think that unfortunately, we're going to have to stick with it and try to move C along as fast as possible and fix the problem. So I guess I'll make that motion that we maintain the status quo.
Okay, so Councillor Van Vliet, thank you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just wondering, Mark, the number of tickets, are they mostly by residents getting the tickets, or are they visitors getting the tickets? Like people going to the beach or the quarry?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to answer that, the tickets that were issued on Maplewood and Woodland, yes, I believe one was from a resident and the rest were from visitors from the quarry. There was lots of warnings that were issued, and our bylaw officer did knock on doors and ask residents to move instead of giving tickets.
Okay, if I can continue. My other question is, if it's mostly just people visiting the beach or the quarry, could we not make like the east side of Quarry Road parking? Because it's wide enough to get fire trucks through. Would that help alleviate some of it?
Look to the operations officer.
Through your worship, to Councillor Van Vliet. It is, Quarry Road was expanded a year ago, 2 years ago, a year ago. But it also includes a sharing of the road for bicycles. So the section that's been widened is from the Gord Harry Trail to Quarry Road, to Lakeshore Road. That was to assist in bicycles that were using the pathway, the Gord Harry pathway, because it is part of the cycling route. How many actually use it, not sure. But the fact is we're trying to create links from that network as well for any future development. So if you end up parking, that means again that we would have to develop a little bit more parking again, so we don't impede the width of the traffic. Because when the lines are painted, if you're within that line painting as well, even though the road may be asphalted, if you're within that line painted for that 6 meters of roadway, you're still blocking a portion of the traffic. Or I would have to extend the road even further to provide that on-street parking.
Okay, counts. Anybody else?
No, you need, I think you need a seconder.
We haven't read anything yet.
Well, technically I made a motion and then we had some discussion after without a second, so we're somewhat out of order. I'll withdraw it for now and let Councilor McClellan speak, and then we'll start again.
Councillor McClellan.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Richard. At the end of Quarry Road at Lakeshore, there's a stretch on the north side of Lakeshore that's kind of, I don't know who owns it and how much of it is ours, and is there any way that we could extend that, clean that up, and put some parking in there? Or have you already looked at this?
Through your worship, to Councillor McClellan, we actually, because of the parking issues on Quarry, Woodland, and Maplewood and Woodland, we actually created those stone parking lots that are there now. We actually built those on our property to provide space for people to park and alleviate some of the issues that we may have on the private roads. The property line technically tapers to the road's edge where it starts into the cemetery. So we can extend it slightly. We keep extending it a little bit more every year, but it literally gets to the point where you have to parallel park because it comes to a point, because of the way Lakeshore Road is laid out. But anything to the north of that is actually NPC. It belongs to the NPCA property, which is part of the quarry. So, that's another issue. I mean, if that's a direction that council wants to choose, we can try and engage them to build a parking area to provide that type of service. But it's a direction of council.
Go ahead,
Through you, Mr. Mayor, again. To Richard, Richard, is that something you could look into with the MPCA and see if that can happen?
Your worship, to Councilor McClellan, I was just pointing it out. It is actually option one of the options. 1E is part of the report as well.
So, still in discussing, but looking at a motion, if we, before we make the motion, if we received it and we kept our enforcement status quo, but if we added in 1C and 1E as well, would that satisfy everybody that we could, number one, keep our parking status as is, continue with the enforcement, and then we would look at doing the surveys and engage Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority. So any discussion on those 4 points for this motion? Councillor Cridlin?
Just before we move that, I'd still like to focus on our implementation so that there's some sense of certainty that the residents know where they're going to be able to park. I know that's all in that for the work, but
Perhaps the CAO could speak to how we might get that started.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I think what we're going to have to do is, again, once council sort of firms up its sort of direction, we will need to communicate and reach out to all the property owners on those, in this case, on those two roads, advising them of what council's sort of direction decision is, and inviting them to get back to us, for example, with respect to encroachments, with respect to the direction we're heading. One of the things, if you are moving into an encroachment style approach, the township currently has a policy that governs or regulates the manner and the details on how encroachment agreements will be sorted. Because of this nature, and that policy is designed sort of as a one-off. You get like once a year, you might get somebody coming in to inquire about encroachments. But in this case, if we're dealing with potentially tens of individuals, hundreds, I don't know what it's going to turn out to be, because we still have the Lakeshore report yet to come. But we may want to review our encroachment policies and practices to make sure, one, they're current, they're fair, and that they can be dealt with in a timely fashion. So even if you embark on that, it's going to take a bit of time, and we will certainly do everything we can to make sure that the public is informed. I do see the bylaw officer sort of raising his hand with some ideas as well.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, in lieu of this coming to council tonight, I've already started drafting a map that I was going to propose that we hand deliver to the residents, informing them of where they can and where they can't park.
Okay, that's excellent initiative on the road. And I was also thinking as well that our student, our parking enforcement student, would be the perfect person to get involved in starting to develop this with our people under your guidance. And that way, those hours are spent proactively creating this plan. So again, there's no good solution for this, but we have to reach something that's workable for everybody. So I think that if we do those with add in 1C and 1E, is there any other discussion? Anybody want to change that motion at all? If not, I can read it out and we can vote on it. Anyone else? Okay, so that this report be received, that parking restrictions and enforcement on Maplewood Drive and Woodland Drive remain status quo, and that we direct staff to undertake property surveys to examine current private encroachments into the road allowance, to assess the feasibility of permitting the encroachments to continue via appropriate agreements where possible, and that we engage the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority to explore potential parking accommodations through them. A mover for that, please. Councillor Gilmore, seconder. Councillor McClellan, all in favor, and that is carried. Thank you. And that's one of them. Okay, and now we'll move on to our parking issue on Lakeshore Road, and I'll ask the bylaw officer to speak to that one as well, please.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. This report, again, is the result of parking and encroachment issues in the summer of 2018. A public meeting and an online survey were also conducted to request feedback from residents on Lakeshore Road. Mainly Lakeshore Road from Cement Road to Quarry Road was the most affected area. You will find in this report results from that public meeting and survey. The 2017-2018 parking ticket statistics again. Staff also reached out to Township Solicitor, Operations Manager, Fire Chief, and Niagara EMS to comment on these issues.
Okay, I look for discussion, questions. CAO, please.
Just one point to maybe help direct council's considerations. For the most part, Lakeshore Road is significantly different in its character compared to the two roads that we just discussed. If we were to go back to the photo that we were looking at earlier, which is very representative of the two side roads, both dead ends, from Quarry Road right to their dead end. They have a very similar character. There's a paved portion of road running basically down the middle of the road allowance, and there's a fairly equal boulevard on both sides. Lakeshore Road, rather than being a dead end, is a through road from Port Colborne all the way through to Haldimand County for all intents and purposes. And rather than being a sort of straight line, it's a meandering road that has changes in topography from ditches and valleys to hills and mountains. There is development that varies from being very close to the road to being far away from the road. It's a completely different beast. So our recommendations are, again, we tried to be as consistent as we could with our options and discussions, but our recommendations here might require some fine-tuning and consideration.
Okay, questions, discussion? Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to point out, I did go out just to help visualize a picture for you. Maplewood Drive, Woodland Drive are 5.7 meters wide. Lakeshore Road fluctuates between 5.4 meters and 6.5 meters in width. Just to put it in some perspective.
Thank you for that, and that's a lot of the source of our angst here in regards to this whole issue is the inconsistency of the road and the location of the road. So any questions or discussion on the parking bylaw for that? Councillor Van Vliet.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Mark, I know we've had this discussion. It's about encroachments on Lakeshore. So people who have paved their driveway, the ones that live up in the hills, and they've come down and paved them right to the road, how does that work? Like,
through you, Mr. Mayor, unfortunately, that is, in some circumstances, that is municipal road allowance. And to my knowledge, the municipality has not given permission for anyone to do that. So technically, from the old parking bylaw to the new parking bylaw, Lakeshore Road has always been no parking on both sides from start to finish at all times. So that would be considered a no parking area as well.
okay, so to continue, as we discussed, so if Joe Smith comes and wants to use the lake and somebody has paved the end of their driveway wider than their driveway and encroached, they can park there, and that's whose problem?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that would be a ticketable offense. So if you have your driveway entrance and it's 24 feet and you have your car parked facing your house, like you're pulling in, but you're at the end of it, that's the apron of your driveway. That would not be a ticketable offense because that's the entrance to your driveway. But if you are then parked parallel beside that area, or even if you are parked perpendicular, but the driveway does not extend to the house because your driveway is beside there, that's a ticketable offense. You're still in a no parking area.
Okay, Mr. CAO would like to speak.
And just to clarify on the difference between the driveway, which is, if you look at the Highway Traffic Act, and hopefully our zoning bylaws and other regulations, a driveway or a laneway is basically a roadway, a private roadway, running from our public roadway up your property. The thing to be wary of is that you can pave your private driveway, you can pave the apron in front of your driveway leading to the traveled portion of road, but if you've widened your driveway at the base of your property, you're basically paving the boulevard, which is still a boulevard and does not become a driveway because you've paved it. And that's a distinction that should be aware of. And I apologize, we don't have a diagram to demonstrate that. But again, if you look at the picture that's in front of you now, that could, for all intents, pretend that's your driveway. if you pave the portion to the left or right of that, you're now paving the boulevard, which is a different creature. And I don't know if I've just made everything worse.
Councillor
Can I
Van Vliet,
continue?
carry on.
So I have driven Lakeshore, I drive Lakeshore, I've been doing it since I was 16. There's tons of driveways that are paved over to the boulevard. Is this something we need to look into?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I believe that is addressed in our report. It is an issue.
Just before we move on, we looked at the same issue here, that if you refer to, like on the second page, 1C, undertake property surveys to examine current private encroachments, and it's virtually, the only solution we could come up with there was virtually the same thing as what we've done for Maplewood and Woodland. So just so everybody's aware of that's a potential. Councillor McClellan, you had a question.
No, well, I just wanted to clarify something that Will was saying. So the little flare at the end of your driveway so you can turn, that's not what you're worried about. We're worried about when you go 20 feet beyond, and yeah, okay, just to clarify that, so.
Okay, any other discussion on this? Councillor Cridlin?
I'm just going to, we're repeating some of the same conversations I know from the last file, but again, I'm looking for some certainty. So, things changed for whatever reason, and tickets were issued last summer, as we experienced. So we have to get to where there's certainty, and I think we're working on tools. So I agree that this is, we need to step into the encroachment file and look at next steps. They may not look like the ones we just talked about. It might be very different because, as the CAO did point out correctly, it's a very different area. So, residents have been told things in the past, and when we talk about past and Wainfleet, that's really deep. So I think it is going to be a one-by-one for now, or, staff brings back something that gives us tools to then have the certainty that residents need. I don't know what the answer is, but I see does look that it might start the file on Lakeshore, but it might be much more complicated.
Thank you for that. Any other comments, questions? Okay, so before I make the motion, I would be doing the two recommendations, and then we would add 1C as well, that we start to look at that. So is there any other discussion, additions, or subtractions from those items before I make that motion? Any discussion? Okay, so then I'll make the recommendation the report be received. Parking restrictions and enforcement on Lakeshore Road remain status quo, and that staff undertake property surveys to examine current private encroachments into the road allowance to assess the feasibility of permitting the encroachments to continue via appropriate agreements where possible with the landowners. A mover for that, please. Councillor Gilmore, seconder. Councillor Van Vliet, all in favor? And that's carried. Opposed? One. Okay, we'll move on to the next bylaw enforcement report, lakefront fences. Bylaw officer, would you like to speak to that one, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, this report is a result of a concern brought forward last year about fencing being installed on lakefront properties in the rear yard, obstructing the view of the lake. A detailed report was brought to Council BSR 022-2018 last year, which resulted in Council directing staff to have a public meeting and an online survey to gain feedback from residents to find out how they want this to play out for them. So this report will outline those findings of that public meeting and online survey.
Okay, discussion, questions? Councillor McClellan.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and maybe this should go to Sarah, I'm not sure who. The lakeside of a home, can we get that called the lake yard so we know what we're talking about all the time? Because some people call that the front of their house, some people call it the back of their house. I had this discussion with Councilor Crinlin, and it's something that should be done, right? So we all know what we're talking about, and 10 years from now, somebody understands what we were talking about. So is that something we can do, Sarah, or for wording or clarification?
Through your worship to Councillor McClellan, that would require an amendment to the zoning bylaw. So those terms and definitions come from the zoning bylaw, and I believe the fence bylaw uses the same definitions. So if it's just for the purposes of the fence bylaw, I don't see why we can't change the definitions in the fence bylaw and have them be separate than the zoning bylaw. Or if you want all of them to have both the zoning bylaw and the fence bylaw take into consideration a lake yard. But currently, so in the zoning bylaw, your front lot line is defined as the lot line that abuts a public roadway.
We probably should.
Okay, so we would require staff to come back with a report on that to council with a change in that recommendation.
Through your worship, so if that were a direction, so there's requirements under the Planning Act to have a public meeting, so I'd have to give notice of that, have a public meeting similarly to what we had tonight for that surplus farm dwelling zoning amendment, and then from that public meeting, come back with a staff report. Now, I am planning an update to the zoning bylaw this year because we need to update the zoning in our hamlets. So if you wish, I could include that as part of that project, but that's not scheduled to happen probably until early fall.
Councillor McClellan.
So again, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Sarah, maybe then we could, for the fencing bylaw, use the terminology lake yard. When you have your updates, we include that in at that time. Does that work?
Through your worship to Councillor McClellan, yes. So if that's the direction of council, then I can certainly add that to the items to review under the zoning bylaw. And then when I schedule a public meeting for that, that will be one of the items I can highlight if that's the direction from council.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the only comment that I would make is that if you are proceeding down that road, the question you have to ask yourself is, are those lake yards going to be treated any differently than a regular rear yard? And if they're being treated exactly the same, do you really require that amendment in the first place? And again, I'm getting ahead of myself there, but I just raised that point. And the other point I would make, and I'm thinking to the Navigable Waters Act, where the lake might need to be treated differently because it's a lake. The question would be, would any navigable waterways, such as rivers, likewise require such sort of treatment? So that, for example, properties backing onto the Welland River or other navigable waterway, if there's some sort of different treatment for them, do you want to consider those as well? So I'm just raising those as it's a bigger issue than just that.
Councillor McClellan, go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Will. I agree with you, and obviously they want to be treated differently. That's why we're here tonight. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an issue. So I think we have to, right, in my backyard, nobody cares how big my backyard fence is. This is an issue, so.
Okay, so I guess we'll look at that further, or further discussion, or do we want to make a motion to make that change now, or have staff bring a report back, input? Councillor McClellan?
Yeah, let's just make a motion now and get it over
Okay,
with.
would you make that motion,
So
please?
make a motion that from now on, lakeside yards are designated as lakeside yards, so that whether it's front yard, backyard, it's the lakeside yard is what it'll be called.
Okay, we have a mover
Might
for
wanna
that,
pass me
please.
that up, but
Discussion? Anybody else with discussion on that? Okay, mover, Councillor Quidlin, seconder? Or John moved it, yep. Seconder. All in favor? And that is carried.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, just for clarification, there's a process as outlined by Sarah regarding a zoning bylaw amendment and a public process. So before that change can fully take effect, that public process under the Planning Act has to occur, just for confirmation.
Okay, so coming back to our lakefront fences bylaw, any other discussion on that? Excuse me. If we add in, oh, there's no 1C on this one. So are there any discussion on this? Councillor Cridlin?
So in the report, it does talk about, 50 years plus of no fences. And I would add that there's sort of some wisdom in that. Also that, the official plan does acknowledge that views have value. Having said that, new people do move in and perhaps have different needs. So whatever happens in terms of the decision of council, it's a loss for people at the lake to have a fence also. So whether it's a loss of a right to have a fence, it will certainly be a loss for the majority of lakefront users. So it's only very recently that, fences are appearing. Yes, there's probably some chain links up, some things that keep dogs in, but, the view and breaking that view is a real loss to Lakeshore, people on the lake side. So if we can come up with something that's either zero or works in the other direction, I'm sure we can come up with something that helps people that are new and, have challenges with, maybe neighbors, but there's lots of examples in the report. So whether we pull out, some of the best pieces, I could try a motion and see if it gets amended, and but otherwise more discussions welcome, obviously.
Yeah, it's great. The new process that we're slowly moving towards is to have all the discussion first, to get that all aired out, and then make the motion once we've all basically figured out what we want. So it saves the amendment to the amendment to the amendment process, which just bogs everything down. So is there a further discussion on Councillor Cridlin's comments? Councillor Van Vliet.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I agree with Councillor Quidlin on this. The only problem is you want to respect people's privacy. So maybe from their house to a certain portion, like sizable for patio set or what have you, would be private, and then no obstruction further. Like, I don't know how many feet it is. I don't live at the lake, so I don't know. But I understand not having that view. And also, like, airflow. If there's privacy fence, 4 feet high, 6 feet high, there's no airflow. So just throwing that out there when you make your motion.
Councillor McClellan.
through you, Mr. Mayor, I tend to agree. My thought on this when I read all this and read all the comments and the recommendations was, you buy a piece of property at the lake and you walk up, and although your property line is here, you tend to look across and look at it. So maybe, I know all the yards are different, so it's going to be really hard to say it's 20 feet or 40 feet, but if we put it in that you can put a 6-foot-high privacy fence for 25% of the distance from most of them are facing south, so we'll say the south corner of your property to the top of the bank or the top of your lawn that's kept cut and maintained. Then if it's 40 feet, you get a 10-foot privacy fence. The rest would have to be chain link, open, glass and steel rail. I don't care what you put in it, but it lets the view through, lets the air through. And I understand people have dogs. Somebody may have raising their grandkids, and you need a fence so they don't get out, but it still doesn't mean that you have to block the view. And it's kind of a code of any lake you go to or cottage you go to, that it's not all fenced off and you can't get out of it or see past it where you're staying. So that's my thoughts on it.
Any other comments? So the paper before us this evening is to have no revisions to the bylaw. So do we want to change that and have staff re-examine the fencing bylaw again for lake rear properties? Anybody, how do you want to word that? You want to make a motion, Councillor Cridland, or?
So would the motion just to bring back a couple options with that kind of input? So a portion of a 6-foot privacy, and then the run of open construction / see-through, and/or that can be if it's see-through, it kind of doesn't matter, but if it's 4 feet, it could be see-through. If it's 3 feet, now they could be solid, but so if it's 4 feet, then that's see-through.
So you would make a motion would be what?
Well, it's just, I don't know if we discussed it enough, but 4 feet is fine, see-through and/or open construction for the rest of the run.
Would we be best to make the motion that staff do research on it, provide options to us for a council meeting down in the future, next couple of council meetings away? Is that a reasonable motion?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, so that motion, make that motion. You're making that motion.
Then,
Councillor Cridland is making that motion. Seconder, Councillor McClellan. All in favor? And that is carried. Okay, and just one more report by our bylaw officer, Tardif. Anything there you'd like to speak to? Okay, that's just the stats report for February. Everybody's had a chance to review that. And a recommendation that report be received. Have a mover for that, please. Councillor Gilmore, seconder. Councillor McClellan, all in favor, and that is carried. And we have a further memo from the bylaw officer regarding the summer municipal bylaw enforcement officer that was hired. Any questions on that? Seeing none, receive that for information. We have a mover on that, please. Councillor McClellan, seconder. Councillor Cridland, all in favor, and that is carried. We move on to council correspondence. And we draw your attention to number 85. And that's from our planner, Sarah. Sarah, would you like to speak to that, please?
Through your worship to all of council. So for a number of years, between the region and the 12 local municipalities, we've had a memorandum of understanding for planning function and services. And the intent of that memorandum is to outline timelines for review of development applications, roles and responsibilities in terms of review and commenting on certain studies. And so in 2018, the work began to update the Memorandum of Understanding, in 2017. And so this final draft has now been approved by Regional Council, and that was after a consultation with both area planners, CAOs, public works officials, chief building officials, as well as the development community. Because Niagara Regions Council has approved it, they're looking for endorsement and authorization for the 12 local municipalities, CAOs to sign off on the memorandum. And again, the intent is to clearly outline roles and responsibilities when it comes to processing planning applications.
Okay, questions, comments from council? Okay, seeing none, recommendation is that the correspondence item C085-2019 be received. That Council for the Township of Wainfleet endorse the updated Memorandum of Understanding for Planning Function and Services between the Regional Municipality of Niagara and the local area municipalities dated March 2019, and that Council for the Township of Wainfleet authorize the Chief Administrative Officer to sign the updated MOU on behalf of the Township of Wainfleet. A mover for that, please. Councillor Gilmore, seconder. Councillor McClellan, all in favor, and that is carried. Okay, moving on to bylaws. Where's my? Okay, the first bylaw is to, oh, sure. Yeah, we'll have the clerk read those.
That the following bylaws be read and passed this 8th day of May 2019. Bylaw number 30, 2019, being a bylaw to close and release the interest of the municipality in part of a public road, being part of the road allowance between lots 17 and 18, concession 2, Wainfleet, designated as Part 1 on 59R 16226, Township of Wainfleet. Bylaw number 31, 2019, being a bylaw to appoint a municipal bylaw enforcement officer for the Corporation of the Township of Wainfleet. Bylaw number 32, 2019, being a bylaw to appoint a drainage superintendent for the Township of Wainfleet.
Mover for those, please. Councillor Gilmore, seconder. Councillor McClellan, all in favor? That's carried. Discussion. I'm sorry about that. Should have had discussion first. Okay, are there any notices of motion? Councillor Cridlin?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As a result of some concern, first of all, this is my first one, so I plan to death by fire. But some concerned citizens have approached me, reached out to me. I'd like to work on bringing back a motion for debate to facilitate discussion regarding companies working within our jurisdiction following established regulations of other levels of government, particularly those perhaps affecting the environment. So it's a bit general at the moment, but I hope to work on that and bring it forward. I'm not sure when. Maybe by the next council meeting.
Okay, could we have that at the next council meeting? That would be, okay. Thank you. Proclamations. My stack of papers tonight's like 8 inches high, so, but we're getting there. Just have a proclamation to read for Air Race Week, June 19th to the 24th, 2019. And whereas the Air Race Classic, ARC, is the world's preeminent longest-running air race for women, and whereas its mission is to emphasize the acknowledgement of female pilots through aviation-based education and outreach programs, and whereas participant racers come from the global community to enhance their experience by sharing skills and to provide opportunity and mentor support for those seeking aviation-based careers, and whereas youth aviation careers or life choices are directly influenced by exposure to positive role models and flying experience obtained at local general aviation airports, and whereas the Township of Wainfleet's shared general aviation asset, the Niagara Central Dorothy Rungling Airport, is named for such a role model and offers multiple ways for the public to experience aviation at a world-class facility. And whereas the Air Race Classic has selected NCDRA, the airport, to be the 2019 terminus finish for the 43rd annual running of its 2,400-mile air race. Therefore, be it resolved that the Corporation of the Township of Wainfleet does hereby proclaim the week of June 19th to 24th, 2019 as Air Race Week. Okay, any other business before we end our evening? Councillor Cridlin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I can't sit in this chair and not mention that there's another dinner in the dairy coming this summer, so look for your tickets. I think we did put something on our website as well. That's in July, and our host is again going to be in Wainfleet. So, the other thing is I got to attend the Greater Niagara Chamber of Commerce luncheon on the amalgamation, and a very, very positive panel was there, and two things that were takeaways. One is collaborate, collaborate, collaborate as we go into this change, and also look for ways to strengthen, this particular for Wainfleet, strengthen democratic infrastructure as we move through this change. So a great event.
Thank you for that. Any other business? Seeing none, have the bylaw read, please.
That the following bylaw be read and passed this 8th day of May 2019, bylaw number 33, being a bylaw to adopt, ratify, and confirm the actions of the council at its regular meeting held on the 8th day of May 2019.
A mover for that, please. Councillor McClellan, seconder. Councillor Cridlin, all in favor? And that is carried. And I have a motion to adjourn, please. Councillor Van Vliet, seconded. Councillor Gilmore, all in favor? And thank you very much. We are adjourned. Thank you.